Happy Monday, June 22nd, 2020. Today, I'm just going to focus on the daily Bible reading that comes to us from Revelation chapter 2, 1 through 7. And this is, if you know anything about the book of Revelation, you know that it starts off with letters to the churches. That God is dictating letters, well, specifically Jesus, is dictating letters to these 7 churches. And he tells them what he likes about them and what he finds wrong with them. Some of them he didn't really even get much of like what he likes about them. But here we have the letter to the church at Ephesus. And I'm not going to read it because you're a grown person and you can read it yourself. So I'm just going to talk about what God likes about them and what he finds lacking in them, because it's pretty important. One of the great things about these letters to the churches is they really help us understand even the problems we have in the church today. He first of all tells them that he likes the fact that they've persevered against all kinds of difficulties. He says, I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary. And so they've stayed the course. They've persevered under all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of struggles. They've persevered against heresies. In other words, they've tested people that came in saying things that didn't agree with what the witness of faith and the revelation that they did have said about God and about Jesus, and they rejected those false apostles. In other words, people coming in saying that they were the disciples of Christ and the true apostles of Christ, but they said things that didn't harmonize, if you want to use that word, or jive, if you want to use that word, with what Christ had said and what the apostles of Jesus Christ had passed down through this apostolic tradition that we have. And so he likes that fact. He's very happy with them for that they tested things and rejected things that were not true, rejected things that were evil and that said false things about God and Jesus, and tried to lead them away from the faith, and that they had even persevered under, presumably under persecutions. And so he's great with them about that. And then he says, but I have this against you. You've forsaken the love that you first had. Now, what does that mean? He basically, I think, and I'm getting this honestly from a guy that was a professor of mine, and let me this guy here, Bob Mulholland. He was an awesome guy. If you ever get to read his stuff, but he was a really great scholar on the book of Revelation. I'm making lots of racket right now. Sorry. I'm mainly apologizing to Danny, who's going to take this later and turn it into a podcast, because he tries to work with the audio, so he gets cross with me when I make noise like that. Anyway, so while he's very happy that they have persevered and they have tested things to see if they were not true, and they have rejected that which was false and claimed to be of God but wasn't. At the same time, they've forsaken their first love. And what does that mean? I am persuaded by Dr. Mulholland to agree with him that basically it's kind of a double-edged sword. They had become so good at making sure everything was right and testing things to see if they were right, and making sure that their teachings and their doctrine and their belief was, the fancy church word is orthodox. They were so focused on being right that they stopped actually doing what was right. In other words, they had stopped doing the work that the church is supposed to do. Well, what's that work? Well, proclaim God's Messiah, proclaim Jesus Christ as the Son of God, the Messiah, proclaim the coming of God's kingdom. And all of that means for the world. If you're not sure what that means, you should go and look at Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 18, where Jesus stands up in the synagogue after he has been baptized by his cousin John in the Jordan River and has been driven out into the wilderness by the Holy Spirit and suffered temptation and suffered under that temptation from the devil, and then has come back among the people, stands up in the synagogue, reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads this part that says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So if you're not sure what it means to proclaim God's kingdom, that God's kingdom has arrived, Jesus neatly defines it for you there. And so what's at stake, having forsaken this first love? How is it that you can persevere against all these heterodoxies, all these untruths about the nature of God and the nature of and the truth of who Christ is and what the kingdom is about? How is it you can do great things and persevere in that and yet fall away from your first love? Well, like I said, it's really easy to get caught up in being right and focusing so much on being right that you cease to do the things that are right, which, like I said, proclaiming Christ as Messiah, proclaiming the advent of God's kingdom, and everything that means, especially as what Jesus himself says to us in Luke. So what's at stake when you do that? It goes on pretty clearly to say, well, let's put it this way. In verse 7, he says, "Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." So we can be so focused on being right and being victorious that we forget what the actual final victory is and what the outcome of that is and what the benefit is. And it is to eat right from the tree of life. What does that mean? Well, here's where you got to jump ahead to the end of the story. Revelations 22, 1 through 2, it talks about the tree of life and what it's like, and it lives by it grows by the river that flows from God, basically, and it says this really important thing, that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the world. I would say to you, I'd posit, here's a big fancy word, that's what God seems to be most interested in. It's not that he doesn't value us being right. In other words, believing and knowing the right things about him and maintaining that truth about who God is and what his nature is and who Christ is. But the point of all that is to do the very things that Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 4. And the point of that is for the healing of the nations. That's what God seems to be most interested in, and that's the point of all the other stuff. If we're not doing that, as God says to the church at Ephesus, we've kind of lost our first love, and we got to get it back. It's really kind of a letter for the loved one in that sense. Well, that was the daily Bible reading for Monday, June 22nd, 2020, and we'll be back tomorrow. I'll boop your nose again. Boop.